So we've all been in broadcasting for a long, long time. And one of the tricks of broadcasting is to broadcast like you're speaking to the person, either listening or watching, listening on the radio or watching on the TV. But there's often a disconnect, isn't there? There is often a cricketer who will go on air and 1 minute would be telling the listener to believe that they love this sport so much that it's the greatest thing ever. But then we know as soon as they put the mic down, they're asleep at the back of the box, or they are just moaning because a declaration hasn't been called.
Name names.
Exactly, right? Now, what I found very interesting about Bazball was at the start of it, if you were listening on the TV or watching on the listening on the radio or watching the TV, you would hear constructive criticism, whether it went right or wrong, but essentially you would believe that the person commentating was behind, or certainly had a viewpoint about Bazball that flew in the face of the reality that you would hear at lunch or tea when you're behind and off air, when you're behind scenes. Right. And I find similarly match fixing within cricket is a story that if on air, and of course there's libel law, so you have to be very careful, but there is the way that broadcasters that we will talk about match fixing on air, very different to the way that we talk about match fixing off air. Off air, the names that we have heard being linked to match fixing roll off the tongue.
Yep.
Now, we cannot say that on air, of course, but the question is, if we at the same point talk about these stories off air liberally and regularly across all countries and across a lot of different formats, how do we talk about it on air without A, getting into trouble, and B, without naming the names that we can do when we're off air? So very simply, the question is this. Do you always believe what you're watching? When you're watching cricket, how often is it that you've thought to yourself, this isn't right? Or do you pretty much think that match fixing is a problem from back in the day and doesn't really affect the game so far at the moment?
Yeah, it still happens. And there are still bits when I'm watching cricket where I think to myself, that doesn't make sense. I've seen bowlers bowl down the leg side with short fine leg up 2 balls in a row, and then the captain moves the fine leg back and they bring the third up, and then he bowls wide outside off stump for the next ball. And you think, this is an incredibly accurate bowler. How come he's managed to do this in the space of a couple of balls? There are certainly moments. I think it's probably less match fixing these days than it is probably individual spot fixing, which I still count as match fixing, but a lot of people like to think of them as different things. But yeah, no, I do think it still happens. I think we have an issue in cricket, which is, Betfair, the exchange, they had an IPL game recently where I think £250 million was exchanged on one market. So it would have been about £350 million exchanged on one game that wasn't even being played in England. Right? So there's international bettors coming to Betfair to do that. My guess is that game would have had somewhere around 1 billion, 1.2 billion traded on it internationally, that game. And it's never reported on. There's no one reporting on the gambling industry. You watch what's happening in American sports and you have a situation where they've just allowed legalized gambling, and straight away, when there's an anomaly in the gambling, people write about it and they go, this doesn't make sense. This player is doing this and people are betting on it. Is this something that we need to look into? We don't even cover that in cricket, right? And we wait for these big moments, or the fake shake or something like that to break these stories. There's a real problem with cricket, and we're not even talking about how the game is bet on, despite the fact that there is more money now being made on the betting of the game than there is on anything else other than maybe the streaming rights and TV rights of the game. Right? Those are the 2 biggest industries. And when there's a new rights deal out, everyone will write about it, right? And we'll hear it over and over again. When $500 million is gambled on one cricket game, no one even covers it. To me, that's where it starts. If we're not even going to look into the legal side of things, and once you start looking at that, you can see the anomalies. There are cricket games that are being played all around the world where you can see betting anomalies happening right in front of your eyes. You talk to anyone that works for the bookies, the back end of the bookies, the guys who set the odds and everything, they will say, would you like a list of players that don't make sense? Or would you like a list of games or leagues that don't make sense? If we're not even there, I think that's where the conversation has to start, because it's where the money goes is where the truth is, right? We could see it right in front of our eyes, and no one even cares about that. There's one guy, Ed Hawkins, who writes a little bit of gambling.
Yes.
And to be fair, these days, Ed Hawkins mostly writes tips on how to gamble, which I'm not having to go at him, but he's still not really looking into, did you see this game the other day? And it was a PSL game, and half a billion dollars was traded on it. What does that mean? Well, what's going on with cricket right now? There's a game in Zimbabwe, and everyone started betting on this one bowler to take more than 4 wickets in the game, or less than a wicket in a game. These are the conversations we should be having, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense not to have those. So I think it starts with that, and we have turned a blind eye, and then when something happens, there may be an example of whoever that player is, right? And we all sit around and talk about the players that we can't name on camera, which is fine, we understand that. But we're not actually looking at the root thing here, which is we can actually track the money, and we can understand what is happening in our game. And as an industry in the media, we've decided not to do that.
When did you first start hearing about match fixing? I mean, you've been playing and you've been involved in the game for so many years. Has it always been there, or was there a period where it's at its worst, or what?
My first recollection would be the Pakistani left-arm over bowler who overstepped, Mohammed Amir, and he was banned from the game, and his captain was involved
Salman Butt,
as well.
So before 2010?
Yeah.
So I'm absolutely staggered at what he said there, and I wouldn't know where to start looking. But those are big numbers that Jarrod's talking about on an individual game, and then I'm guessing there would be a spike on one particular issue in the game.
Yeah.
There would be a spike that all the money's gone bang there. So that would be an interesting to see who was involved at that time.
And the cricket boards look at this stuff.
Well, there's anti-corruption.
Yeah.
These are high-quality people. The anti-corruption people are high quality. Police commissioners and so on from around the world. And you can see them walking round the ground and round the stands. And they're bringing people out who are on laptops.
You see them in the hotels.
Yes, you do.
They're in the foyer all day long. The problem with anti-corruption, and as you said, a lot of them are great former, security officers and police, and corporate.
Police.
They've worked in corporate jobs for companies. Fraud, all these sorts of things. The problem is that cricket is so complicated that they're not Interpol, right? Yeah. And even Interpol can't solve international crimes, right? So Salman Butt, before he was caught, I was told by someone inside cricket that he had 7 phones. Right. Try track those sorts of things down, and the level of they are so far ahead. And if we're not going to talk about any issues about it, that actually just helps it. It helps it go ahead, and I think that's my issue.
So the other thing that seems to have just gone into the background, that players around the world were encouraged to report any incident, any approach, and that it tended to get reported but that's gone quiet. We're not hearing that he or she has reported an incident that's happened in a hotel or by telephone. We're not hearing that now. It seems to have drifted away, and I might be quite naive that that was that first instance. And I was England coach when we won the Champions Trophy in Sharjah, and that tournament is talked about. There are only 4 teams. There are 4 teams in it in Sharjah. And that is talked about. And I was coach, and I didn't see anything untoward. I just thought we won it fair and square. That's great. But people will talk about that as being a questionable tournament,
a questionable cricket ground.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is that it comes down to we have an anti-drugs organisation, WADA, right, that does all sport, and that came out of the fact that clearly something was going on in sports in the 70s and 80s, and people were like, we need to clean this up, right? We need to stop drugs being so rife. Otherwise, we're just, these German...
Enhancing drugs.
Yeah. Right? So we need to stop that. So we get a global perspective and we stop drugs. Corruption in sport is worse than drugs has ever been. This is not a cricket issue, right? But if you run the ICC or you run the 100, right, and a player's fixing, is it really in your best interest to flush out the story that your players are fixing, right? That's not going to help you sell tickets. It's not going to help you sell shirts. It's not going to help you get sponsors, right? So the people who are in charge of looking into corruption, it's not in their best interest to find corruption, right? So again, we're in a situation where how is it supposed to get any better? So the ICC, they have people available, but the ICC really only police their events, right? So if you're fixing in a domestic tournament, that is up to the individual board. Well, why would the individual board want to be able to find all these sorts of things? This isn't a cricket issue, by the way. I would say this is right across all sports. There is no reason for any sport to ever actually go out and find corruption.
So do you think that, say, in domestic cricket, the UK, there is a problem?
If cricket is broadcast, there is always a chance, right? Because once it is broadcast, it can be bet on. And once you can make money off it, that's when it all opens up, right? So we have already seen domestic county cricketers be involved in match fixing before. Obviously, was it Mervyn Westlake went to jail. So it's already happened once that we know, publicly. We know of other players, of course, who've been suspended because of what they've done in county cricket. But the minute you put it on TV, and I'm not just talking about county cricket, that European Cricket Network, there are allegations throughout that league. Right? This is how bad it's getting. It's not just about gambling anymore. Dream 11, your fantasy cricket?
Yes.
Yeah. I've heard stories about, because you can win money off the back end of that, of people manipulating their fantasy 11 stats in certain leagues, right? That's how far it's going. If we're not going to have any conversations about this, nothing gets cleaned in the dark, right? And we refuse in cricket to turn the light on, and we both know what is talked about when the lights are dark and we're in the other place. Now, that's not to say you've seen all these things. Most cricketers will say, you hear stories, but you're not 100% sure. The truth is that we all have our suspicions, but if there's no conversations about fixing, I don't really see how that helps the sport.
And like many issues, there's such a concern about litigation. Prove it, I'll take you to court. So you can't name. But I'm quite naive. I turn up at Emirates Old Trafford and just say, what a great game, it was good. We were good, they were better. Get in the car and drive home. And I'm listening
You've seen suspicious stuff before.
I can't, Jarrod, I really can't think. My eyes were wide open when you're saying that, this deadly accurate bowler with fine leg inside the circle, suddenly ball sliding 3 down, he'd gone over there, captain changes it, moves it round, and suddenly flies a couple down that. Really? So I'll be watching more closely.
One of my favourite ones was in the ICL. Do you remember the ICL, which came before the IPL? It was the Rebel League. Did you work in that one? You probably umpired.
No, but a friend of mine, Abhishek, played in that.
He did. There was a game I was watching in that where...
Ended his career, pretty much.
Yeah. It did. There was one guy, I'm pretty sure, was trying to bowl down the leg side on purpose to bowl wides, and there was a batter, Bumble, who was trying to kick ball, because he's trying to stop the wide. So I think they're on 2 different fixes. And I was watching it, and it was midway through the first season, and I was thinking to myself, what are the odds that they would have 2 different fixes at the same time going from 2 different syndicates? But also, how often have you ever seen a player in T20 cricket trying to get their leg inside the ball and this medium pacer only managing to bowl down the leg side? At some point, you have to ask questions. But we also see a lot of horrible cricket played by smart cricketers all the time. Look at the fielding standards in the IPL at the moment. People have been getting hit in the chops with the ball, right? There was a guy on the boundary the other day. It was like catching a little throw from your friend, and he managed to do this over his shoulder for 6. The fielding standard in that league, you would have to say, it is so bad that who's to say that isn't just bad fielding? We've seen bad fielding all around the world, all the way. That's why you then have to look.
But isn't fielding better than it ever was?
Well, it wasn't in that particular ball, I can tell you there. But you know what I mean? So you have to go back and look at the betting records and see if there's an anomaly here. Yeah. Right? We have the data now. We don't have to pretend that we don't have that information anymore.
On AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.